Hello and welcome to the Justice Factor. Nomzamo Winnie Madikizela-Mandela, an iconic feature of our lives and our politics since the 1960s, passed away on Monday. Today we'll discuss her life and her legacy. After that discussion, we'll look at what was supposed to be the day that Nelson Mandela Bay Mayor Athol Trollip would be toppled. But last Thursday, the planned motion against Trollip degenerated into hours of chaos, insults, threats, and scuffles. And Trollip is still the mayor. He will join us later on in the show. After that discussion, we'll give you, as usual, our winner and loser of the week. But first, how should we remember Winnie Madikizela-Mandela? How shall we honor her? My guests now are political analyst Sithembile Mbete from the University of Pretoria and Lebohang Pheko, Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective. Welcome to the show. Can I start with you, Sithembile? You've got some personal reflections and recollections of Winnie Madikizela-Mandela. Would you like to share those with us?
Well, my mother's family is from, well, my mother grew up in Orlando West in Soweto, and Mum Winnie was such a part of that community, and when there were bereavements, she would come as Olila, come and see the families. And so with our family as well, she'd come when my grandmother passed away, when my aunt passed away, to come and grieve with the family. And so she was somebody who was very well known in the community, and who also in her church, at the Meadowlands Methodist Church, was a part of her community of faith as well. And I think that is, and one of the things that I've tried to say, speaking about her death, is that there's so much about her as a symbol, as an icon of the struggle, but there's so many people where she was a mother, she was a caregiver in communities, both in Soweto, where she spent most of her life, but also, when she was banished to Brandfort, she served as a caregiver within that community as well. And I think that it's that personal part of her life, or the kinds of personal relationships that people were able to build with her, that we must not forget also as we speak about her legacy.
Lebohang, Pheko, is that something that we're ignoring in the hours since she passed away, that we've spoken about the big Winnie Madikizela-Mandela?
I mean, I think this raises really good points, that we like things that are neat and tidy. We like to box people. We like things that are either black or white. We like things that are simple and easy to package. And the thing with complexity is that it can never be packaged, and legacies can never be packaged. And I think the best legacies are those where people are full of contradictions. And I think Mayor Winnie was full of contradictions. She was, and I think I said earlier on that she was, in as much as she was a victim, she was in some ways a victimized, and as much as she was brutalized, she could also be brutal. And I think in as much as she suffered systemic violence, she too was a political machine, and she survived and travailed over some very complex and difficult times. And we want to assume that people should only be one or the other, and yet, because as people we are not always, we are complex beings, we are ever evolving beings, and it would be a shame if we forget the mother, the carer, the political animal, we forget the revolutionary, the icon, the person who was a prisoner in her own, a political detainee in her own right, and of course, we should never just reduce her to being the wife of.
Exactly.
I want to come back to who she was, but is this society, South Africa, ready for that complexity? One of the things that I've found in the hours since her passing on Twitter, where you've made some comments, Ste, is that it's almost a two-stream. Some people will say she was this and it was that, and we refuse to acknowledge that she could have.
That we can reside in multiple places and multiple spaces concurrently. Goodness can also reside with complexity. Righteousness and wrongdoing can reside together, and that's the human condition. And it's not only a South African thing. I think that many countries and many spaces and places battle to remember people, and history and memory as a kind of a mechanism to recall the best of who we want to be and the best of who we want other people to be, becomes very complicated. And it's not only Winnie, it's Indira Gandhi, it's Margaret Thatcher, particularly women leaders, I hasten to add. It's Joyce Banda next door. It's Golda Meir. It's Evita Peron. There's a way in which we want people to be all things and everything that is great and righteous, and yet we don't want to accept that there are dark corners as well.
But I do think that Winnie Mandela has been particularly vilified in South African history since the late 80s, early 90s, and that has been the dominating feature of the way in which she's spoken about publicly. And I think that a lot of what we've seen on Twitter, on social media, is a necessary corrective, is people saying, well, actually, let's look at her away from the past 25 years or 26 years in which the only story about her that was coming out publicly was the story of villain, and to say, actually, what did she mean to us outside of that? And the thing is that she meant, you know, she kept Nelson Mandela's name alive during the struggle. She kept struggle alive.
Is it correct to say that her story is one of villain? If you look at just in the live feed we had here on ENCA before we came on air, you had young activists from the EFF. Possibly the person who's spoken most movingly about her tonight has been Floyd Shivambu. So there's a generation of young people who say, this was an icon, this was a hero.
Indeed, but the mainstream discourse about her is one of vilification. And one of the things around young activists is that they've picked up on her story almost as a resistance against the mainstream narrative about her as some evil, demonic woman that didn't deserve to be with Nelson Mandela. And I think that, you know, what young activists have done is that they've picked up her story, we've taken it, and we've wanted to learn more about her.
And I think to pick up on that is, not only have people wanted to learn more about her, I think that the other thing that's happening is a movement against what I thought was a hideous and extremely brutal erasure of her legacy over the last few years, which was actually resuscitated in a perverse way by the passing of Mbete Mandela. And I think that there was an attempt to unwrite and rewrite, to overwrite the villain, but to completely unwrite everything else that, you know, that was Mayor Nomzamo Madikizela-Mandela, which was all sorts of things. And I think that was a very sinister, unpalatable, anti-historical view of things, because just because a person is complicated and cannot be boxed and cannot be tamed, because she was one woman who would not be tamed. She would continue to challenge. Even now she can't be tamed. We're spending, hours and hours and, you know, expending lots of data because she cannot be tamed. And I think that in trying to, because she couldn't be tamed, there was an attempt to erase her, to rewrite her, and to unwrite her. And I think that's one of the greatest injustices.
If we look at tonight, we look over the next few days, many, many words will be written, many will be said by people like ourselves here. One of the longest discussions I've ever had with people who work on this show was, do you mention, and this is the two-stream discussion that's been on social media, it's, oh, she was a murderer, all these things about Sithembile and so forth, and then no, she was an icon, she was a hero and so forth. And do we mention that? And how do we mention it? And I don't have a resolution for that. I find solace in your words about complexity, but I don't know how you deliver a eulogy, a truth, where you can say it was the UDF, it was Cyril Ramaphosa, it was Mefumurebe Vali Musa and others who stood up and said we distance ourselves from her. How do you incorporate it into this telling of her story?
But why make that why make her accountable for that? I suppose, you know, why make her singularly accountable for that? That the UDF, that our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, distance themselves from her, they must answer for that. That's not her. That's them. That's decisions that they made at the time. And so to place that onto her story and her narrative as now the defining feature of who she was when it was not, is deeply problematic. And I think that that's what we need to think about, is that how do we tell her story in a way that centers her as Nomzamo Madikizela-Mandela, and not in a way that centers all of these unfortunately, men that have had something to do with the story of her life.
And added to that, I think that it's also, it's a thin line. I mean, life is complex. It happens to us, but we also happen to it. Circumstances happen to us. We also happen to them. And she was caught up in the midst of really brutal circumstances. And this is not to remove agency. And I think this is also not to remove from the lack of resolution that many people still have, and many families who lived through that time and who lived through her wake, so to speak. I do think that there are many people in this country and many people globally who have committed, I'm not going to mention names, and I said it earlier, you know, men who have committed all sorts of heinous offenses. You know, we don't reduce people's legacy to the stuff that happened in Angola, the stuff that happened in Tanzania, and as children of exile, you know, many of us were party to some very unsavory and brutal stuff that happened in many places as in the name of the struggle. And I think that, you know, a lot of people ascended to cabinet positions, and nobody focuses on that. And I don't say that we should erase and airbrush, but I do think that we need to be a bit holistic, and I do want to insist that that women tend to be treated with far greater brutality and with a far greater level of scrutiny, such as some of the women that I have mentioned. And there's no getting away from that we want saints, we want perfect women, we want quiet women, we don't want women who are complicated, much less women who are noisemakers. So a woman like Winnie, because she is she's not a Mother Teresa, she's not a Lady Diana who you can say, oh well, she died in a tunnel, oh shame. It's so much harder, it's so messy.
Indeed. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for your reflections. I think it really adds so much more to the person we discussed today. Sithembile, Mbete and Lebohang, Pheko, thanks so much for your time. After the break, Nelson Mandela Bay Mayor Athol Toleb